If you start a podcast, at some point you're going to want to make money. Probably the most commonly asked question, and the subject of this video is, how do I monetize my podcast? In our series, How to Start a Podcast. Hi, I'm Mike Carruthers. When people ask, how do I make money with my podcast, my answer is always, with an audience. If you have a large targeted audience for your podcast, you really can't help but make money. But if you don't have much of an audience, it's close to impossible. Your podcast is like that hypothetical tree in the forest. If it falls and no one hears it, does it make a sound? If no one's listening to your podcast, it has no value. So you have to promote your podcast. Social media is a great start. Every time you podcast, you should tell the world through Facebook, Twitter, and any other way you can think of. It also helps to create an email list through an opt-in offer on your website. So every time you podcast, you can email your list and ask them to share your podcast. A great technique to attract listeners is to invite other podcasters and bloggers to be guests, if they're appropriate. Then they'll publicize their appearance on your podcast, sending their followers to you, and perhaps they may have you on as a guest, giving you even more exposure. Follow blogs on your topic and leave comments that point back to your podcast. Of course, this all takes time, but it is so essential. You must get out and promote your podcast to attract an audience. As you're building your audience, one way to start making some money is to use the PI or CPA model. PI stands for per inquiry. CPA means cost per acquisition. Essentially, when someone takes an action, you get paid. Audible.com has a program for podcasters where they will pay you $15 for every person you send who signs up for one of their free trial memberships and downloads a free audiobook. You must first have your podcast up and running so they can approve it. Here's the website to learn more. There are other companies that will do this type of arrangement. I work with a firm that will pay $24 per lead, but you have to have a decent size audience to start, and there is also an approval process with them. There are some rep agencies or podcast networks that will represent your podcast, meaning they'll go out and attempt to get advertisers for your podcast and other podcasts. If you search advertisers for podcasts, you will see some. They work primarily on a CPM basis or cost per thousand, meaning they'll get advertisers to pay anywhere from a few dollars up to perhaps $20 per thousand downloads of your podcast. Perhaps the most lucrative way to make money on your podcast is by getting a sponsor. That is an advertiser who wants to be associated with your podcast because your audience is the audience they're trying to reach. For example, if you're doing a podcast about cars, getting a motor oil company to sponsor your podcast might be a good fit. A sponsor typically pays a higher cost per thousand than a run-of-the-mill advertiser, and if you acquire the sponsor directly, there's no sales commission to pay. You need to identify and approach those companies that might make good sponsors, and it takes work. Think of a radio or TV station. They have salespeople out every day knocking on doors trying to find sponsors. It takes time, but if you stick with it, eventually a deal will come. You can also use your podcast to sell your own products or services if you have them as part of your business. But as I said at the start, you must first have an audience. That's what you're selling. Advertisers are buying access to your audience. That's really all they're buying. The bigger the audience, the more they'll pay. So you first must create a great podcast that attracts, engages, and grows that audience, and then promote the heck out of it. I hope you've enjoyed this series, How to Start a Podcast. For more help and training, please go to the website perfectyourpodcast.com. I'm Mike Carruthers. Thanks for watching.